Welcome to FT Markets. Famously, during the financial crisis of 2008-9, asset-backed securities, or sliced and diced loans, were branded financial weapons of mass destruction for allegedly causing the crisis. Volumes have been subdued since, both in the US and Europe, but now they're making a comeback. With me to discuss this is Annabelle Schaafsma, Managing Director of Structured Finance at Moody's, the credit rating agency. Welcome, Annabelle. If we see our first graph, we can see that after the financial crisis, we saw a big dip in asset-backed securities and mortgage-backed securities. Are we now seeing a bit of a recovery, and what can we expect for next year?
Yeah, I mean, we're quite positive about 2015 issuance. We're expecting an increase in deal flow of between 10 and 15%. And this is really on the back of the general macroeconomic recovery that we're seeing across the region.
And if we go to our second graph, we can see in the US how, well, the volumes were a lot bigger before the crisis, but they've also come back a lot more strongly since the crisis. I guess firstly, is our asset-backed securities, are they something to worry about? Should we be worried about this recovery? And why haven't we seen this recovery in Europe?
Well, interestingly, in Europe, if you look at the performance of the transactions through the crisis, they've actually performed relatively well, even in those periphery countries that have seen elevated unemployment rates, such as Spain. When you look at the underlying securities themselves, there have been very minimal losses. So in terms of asset quality in Europe, we've seen pretty good asset quality, even in a more stressed macroeconomic environment.
So you would disagree that they're financial weapons of mass destruction? We should no longer be worried?
Certainly here in Europe, I would say that's the case, yes. I think there are some good macroeconomic fundamentals that are supporting the recovery of asset-backed securities in Europe. And you will also, in our recently published report, on the outlook for 2015, you'll see that actually our sentiment across Europe is that these transactions will have a stable outlook. And in fact, in the UK, where the macroeconomic environment's been more positive, here we have a positive outlook.
Excellent. And if we go on to our final graph, we can see this is the monthly issuance of asset-backed securities only in Europe. And we saw a kind of mini peak over the summer, but of course, just a couple of months ago, the European Central Bank announced that it would begin purchasing asset-backed securities from banks as a funding mechanism. Since then, we've seen a bit of a spike. Do you think is the ECB succeeding in trying to resuscitate the European ABS market?
We think that the ECB purchase program will have a mildly positive impact. The more stronger impact is actually the better improved macroeconomic environment across Europe. Some of the bigger barriers to entry for the market as a whole is in fact surrounding the regulatory capital requirements for investors that hold these securities.
And we can see split between the senior tranches, which of course are the ones that the ECB is allowed to buy, and the lower rated tranches, the subordinated, which would suffer losses first. We've seen a recovery in the subordinated tranches this year compared to previous years. Is that anything to worry about, that we're seeing more kind of elevated volumes of riskier ABS potentially?
Well, I think because of the good performance across the sector, investors have felt more comfortable investing in these securities. So whereas before they were looking at those senior tranches, which in effect got the cash flows first and were allocated the losses last, they're now more comfortable to take on a bit more risk with these subordinated tranches where they receive cash after the senior notes and the losses are allocated before the senior notes.
And investors hunt for yield. Do you see appetite diminishing in any way for ABS next year?
I think the appetite is definitely there. I think it becomes more a question of the supply of the securities. And that really relies on the generation of new mortgage and other loan origination. And depending on how active the ECB is in its purchase program, how widely investors are able to participate in the investment in these securities.
Thank you, Annabelle. So there we have it. ABS have gone from being the sinner of the financial crisis to the potential savior of the Eurozone economy now that the ECB is buying them, but still a way to go for the recovery in Europe to match US levels.